Ska ni inte flytta? Eller ni kanske sitta där och så går ja, sätt det här. Ja. Sätt det där.
Yes.
Do we need this one? Okay. Just leave it like this. Okay. Welcome all of you. I'm Lennart Wålgemo, and I'm in the board of FUF. We are going to have a meeting today on South Africa, and I'm very sad that not more people came. This is the only meeting in Stockholm this year on the 20th anniversary of South African, it's not independence, what do you call it? Freedom, yeah. And this was a dream that no one could believe would happen when we were in the midst of it. And many of the people here and many Swedes were very engaged in the trying to support the liberation struggle with all means but fighting. So it was a big day 20 years ago when South Africa became independent. Now there is 20 years has gone, and there is a new generation in South Africa and in Sweden who never has, who don't know about, who haven't been involved in the liberation struggle. And when I recently was in South Africa, I found that actually they don't know very much about it. And so is also true in Sweden. It's surprising. There is an effort to see what the school books in Sweden says about the Swedish engagement in the liberation, in the support of the liberation struggle, and it's very little. But I still think that the people who are here are very interesting, and we are lucky to have in our midst Maxi Schoeman.
It's okay.
Schoeman. Schoeman, yeah. Schoeman. That's Afrikaans. Who is a professor from Pretoria University, but here as a Claude Acke stipend, or a professorship in the memory of Claude Acke. Claude Acke was, I think, one of the greatest African political scientists from Nigeria, and he died very sadly about 12 years ago. And he was very active in also in Sweden. Actually, he gave yearly lectures in the peace and conflict department of Uppsala University, and he was here every year. And he was also very close to the Swedish government with giving advice and so on. And to show our allegiance to what he has done, and particularly as a scientist, there is this annual professorship in memory of Claude Acke, and this year it's Maxi. And Maxi has promised, no please, to give us an introduction on the developments in the past 20 years. It's of course a very big task, and you don't have too long. But still, I mean, and what we are interested in is both to hear the positive, but also the challenges that you are meeting. So, and then we have two discussants who are giving shorter comments to the developments and also to what Maxi has said. It's Magnus Walan from Diakonia and Bengt Säve Söderbergh, a former permanent secretary on development cooperation. And very much also engaged in the liberation, in the support of the liberation struggle in the years just before the freedom period of freedom. Okay, Maxi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be here. I'm really glad that I have this opportunity to speak to you. You must forgive me. I'm an academic. We tend to read more than we speak, but I will try to do it as informally as is possible. I'm going to give a fairly critical reading of what is going on in our country, and also when looking back over the past 20 years. I think that's part of the role of an academic, is that we need to be critical. But I do want to start off by noting that I am very much aware that in being critical, I am actually capturing one of the big achievements of South Africa's democracy and freedom. In other words, the fact that one can say what one believes, that one can critique freely. Believe me, 25 years ago, that would not have been possible, either inside the country, and as many of you would know, also not outside of the country. Had you gone outside, they wouldn't have allowed you back. So I am very aware of that in being critical of my country. And I'm going to do perhaps a little bit of a, let's call it a political economic critique, because I find the lens of political economy quite a good one with which to look at what has been happening inside South Africa over the past 20 years. Now, I want to start off, I think, especially the students here may remember, because we all learn it when we are first-year political science students. There is the American political scientist Harold Laswell's definition of what is politics. He says it's about who gets what, when, and how. And then there's a political economist, the late Susan Strange, who used to say, we always need to ask cui bono, who benefits. And for me, if you combine those two, it really helps you not just to describe, but actually to go a little bit under the surface and to look into power struggles and this whole question about who is it who decides who will get what, when, and how. And for me, or rather, that is what I would like to try and do a little bit tonight, because I think that in the allocation of resources in our country, what we are seeing at the moment, after 20 years of independence, is a kind of a story of the past 20 years, the struggle for who will get what, and how will they get it, and when will they get it. And it is about the three big legacies from the apartheid era, things that we are unfortunately still struggling with as much as, if not more than, we did earlier on. And those three things are poverty, inequality, and unemployment. They remain the three big problems in the country. And what I want to try and do is look a little bit at why this is so. And that's why I say it's a fairly critical reading. I think that what is happening in the country at the level of understanding things is that we are perhaps not really understanding how significant the current daily protests are that we are seeing. We do not only have the violent daily protests in the country, we have huge conflict within the tripartite alliance, in other words, between COSATU, the SACP, the Communist Party, and the governing party, the ANC. We've got huge conflict within the labour movement. So the country is to a very large extent riddled with conflict at this point. And I think that the reason for this, the main reason, is when we keep in mind these legacies of the apartheid era that we need to address, that the main reason is that what we're confronted with is an unresolved class struggle. And that class struggle is unresolved because we have, to some extent, a crisis of leadership. We came through especially the last part of the apartheid era and then the early post-apartheid years with very strong leadership. But it's a generation of leaders that have now largely left the stage. And I think a lot of people are asking themselves, who will be the leaders in the third decade? Who will take up this struggle? Because it did not end with the with the end of apartheid. I think it is as alive, perhaps at a different level today, as it was 20 and more years ago. But let me just first point to a few of the achievements of the past 2 decades. Everything is not always glum and negative. I think the first one is surely the consolidation of democracy. I think we can say after the most recent elections, we've now had our 5th elections, I think we can say with a fair amount of certainty that South Africa is a democracy, that we've managed to consolidate that democracy, that as is the case in many democracies in our contemporary era, there are of course some challenges to it, but we see the growth of opposition parties, we see the growth of support for some of these parties. It's like a normal democracy we want. Second, I think that South Africa still has a fairly vibrant civil society, and this is facilitated largely through press freedom. There have been some attacks or attempts at attacks on press freedom. Some of you may be aware of the about a 2-year-long struggle against legislation, what we call in South Africa the secrecy bill. And to a very large extent, that struggle has been won. And one of the reasons why one can still understand what is going on in the country and be aware of what is happening is exactly because of our press freedom, which is still very much alive and well. As far as our material living conditions are concerned, also a number of, I think, some very good achievements. Let me give you a few statistics. Households living in formal dwellings increased by 91% over the past 20 years. In other words, moving people out of shacks and into formal living quarters. That's not a small achievement. I really think it's something to be hugely proud of. Our real gross domestic product has increased by 32% per capita. There's always a downside to each of these, and I'll come to it later on. Another very striking improvement, especially for those of you who were young yourselves during the apartheid years and the years of the struggle against apartheid, the number of students enrolled in South African universities has increased by 78%. I mean, it's enormous. Again, a wonderful achievement. Number of black senior managers in the economy has increased by 885%. The number of people who receive social grants every month have increased from around just over 2 million to the current more or less 17 million. Again, a huge improvement. Means, of course, that almost a third of the total population receive social grants, but still, we've got that a kind of a safety network in place now, which was not there 20 years ago. One can also point to the fact that the majority of black people in the country now have access to electricity and water, an enormous improvement on what the case was during the apartheid years. So overall, a good story that we can tell the world. Although, as I say, the 3 core challenges are still with us. Unemployment has increased from, in the narrow definition of it, but it's the same for the broader definition. Unemployment has increased from 20 to 26% over the past 20 years. The Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has deteriorated. And the percentage of black Africans living in poverty increased by 10% between 1994 and 2014 over the past 20 years. So you see problems in all 3 of those areas despite these very good achievements. I think that this growing inequality, because I'm going to say something about where the 32% increase in the GDP per capita, where it has gone to over the past 20 years, I think this growing inequality has very much to do with the choice of economic ideology, if you want. what we accepted in 1994 with the negotiation of our settlement in the country. We are very proud of the fact that it was a homegrown settlement, that it was largely negotiated back home, but it was not negotiated, although it was a South African settlement, it was not negotiated in an ahistorical setting. It was negotiated in a very particular time, or time in history, especially as far as the international political economy of the early 1990s was concerned. In other words, we wrote into that negotiated settlement an acceptance of liberal economics, which over time developed into what I call, and several of my colleagues in South Africa refer to, as hypercapitalism. And that had a very particular impact on the extent to which one really had the freedom to address some of these core challenges that we were facing in the country. So what happened at the time, I'm not saying that we had no other choice, but what happened, and especially when we look at the Mbeki era, was a very particular choice for a liberal economic approach to our economy, which meant that very soon after we had established the Office for the Reconstruction and Development Plan, it was closed down again, and South Africa adopted the GEAR, which was very much the Growth and Employment Opportunity Act, very much an act that opened up the markets even further, that liberalized trade even further. And one can understand why that happened. South Africa was hugely dependent at the time on foreign direct investment. And we believed that in opening up the economy even further, in adopting this liberal approach to economic organization, that would attract the foreign investment that we require to address those three core problems. The problem, of course, with that belief was the fact that in the early to mid-1990s, we also saw the era in the global political economy that we now refer to as the financialization of the global markets. In other words, money starting to move in very easily over borders, but moving out as quickly as it moved in. Also, by financialization of the markets, it meant that the investment that came into the country did not necessarily go into the productive areas of the economy, those areas where you produce things, where you produce commodities, where jobs are being created. That's not where it went into. So one can look at the figures for the money flowing into the country. It does not necessarily say that it stayed in the country. It's a very uncertain kind of investment, and it was not the kind of investment that was required to create jobs. So it was hugely problematic. And the economic ideology of the day determined that kind of investment and determined that that the state had to keep its hands off the economy. Compare that, those of you, the old struggleites who are sitting here, you will all remember the 1950s, Kliptown, the Freedom Charter, that idea of the country, the land, the resources. It belongs to all of us. That was made very clear. That is not the kind of economic policy that then flows from that negotiated settlement. So when we look back at that settlement, we now see the impact of that strategy of liberalization. I find it interesting that in the year 2000, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the foreign ownership on the stock exchange was 6% of the total of what was traded there on a daily basis. By 2012, it was 31% foreign ownership of the stock exchange. Now, that is not a bad thing. Please do not get me wrong. I think it can even be a good thing at times, because it means there's a foreign stake in your economy. It can give you a little bit of a cushion at times, although that doesn't necessarily work so in an emerging economy. But I think the problem with this kind of thing is that it reinforces amongst your general population, especially people who suffer high levels of deprivation. It fosters a sense of no stake in this economy. Others have a stake in this economy. People from outside have a stake in the economy, but we who live here, we don't have a stake in that economy. And I often listen to our economists back home, and, you know, they go on and on around strikes in the mining industry saying, but these people should just think logically. And I think to myself, no, we have different forms of logic. There is a logical explanation if you are a very rich mine owner. There's a completely different logic at work if you are a poor mine worker, whose logic is the right kind of logic. And I think that by looking at something like ownership of the stock exchange, we get this sense of where do these increasingly violent struggles that we see, where do they come from? What is the basis for them? And we would be wrong if we would try to look at them in a kind of trying to find a kind of a logic which is not related to the daily lived experience of people. There's another statistic that I find interesting around this whole idea of over 20 years we grow the economy to the extent that there's a 32% increase in the GNP per capita. And that is that the wage share of the gross domestic product decreased from 56% in 1994 to 50% by 2010. In other words, what are we saying? The workers have steadily been getting a smaller share of the national income. That explains to us why poverty remains a very big problem in the country. Some economists explain this on the basis of a lack of productivity. Again, that is not necessarily how workers look at this. For them, it's a case of they see the wealth being grown in the country, but they have a smaller and smaller stake in this. Their share is actually shrinking as time passes. And that is why I say that in 1996, when we closed down the Office for Reconstruction and Development and made this choice for a very liberalized economic approach, that to a large extent tied the state's hands in terms of what it could do in order to restructure the economy. And what was decided on, especially during the time of Thabo Mbeki's presidency, there was a choice for black economic empowerment, but through building a black economic elite and believing that and this is typical of a liberal economic approach, believing that if you grow that elite, the money that was generated, the growth in the economy would trickle down to ordinary people. But what we see is that did not happen. The money concentrated at the top, if you want, and there was no trickle down to ordinary people. So the plan to broaden the economic base in the sense of just working at the top and absorbing some new black business people, entrepreneurs, if you want, at the top, and thinking that would trickle down, it very soon turned out that it would not work. And how it was foreseen, how it would work out, apart from the trickle-down effect, was that the new state, through its procurement policy and its program of restructuring state assets, would be able to use regulation and these procurement policies to provide access for black people into the economy, and that in that way it would be possible to address these problems of inequality, unemployment and poverty. However, as we know, that did not really work. And what we see now, as I say, is this unresolved class struggle, which is now, after 20 years, really coming to the fore again. I think another aspect of this is when we look more specifically at the unemployment problem, is the very high figure of unemployment amongst the youth. We can say it's 26% across the board. But amongst the youth, the age group roughly between 18 and 34, it's 50%. In certain areas of the country, geographic areas, it's much higher. It goes as much as 70% and even higher in some of the other areas. And this is a very big problem, and this is going to be an increasing problem for us in South Africa over time, because I think there are levels of frustration and hopelessness among the youth that are dangerously high, and that those frustrations will grow over time. People very often, especially in government, point to the successes that I've pointed out earlier: more houses, access to water and electricity, more young people in university. But the problem is that if you cannot create jobs, you do not actually create a future then for young people. What do you have to look forward to? And that is why I say it is going to become an increasingly big problem for us in the country, is addressing the whole issue of youth unemployment. There is talk now in terms of the National Youth Bill of creating jobs in that way, of easing up on labour legislation to encourage business to employ more young people. Some of you may know that the labour movement is to a large extent against this. It's a very tough debate in the country. So one of the options is perhaps to use the state itself to create these job opportunities through large-scale public works, your infrastructure problems, projects, etc. But it's a very big debate, because what we have constantly is, of course, a counter-argument coming from a liberal economic perspective, saying the state should not get involved to that extent. The state should not create these jobs. The jobs should be created in the private sector. What does one do if the private sector cannot create those jobs? What do you do with these people? You can say you now have 78% more students at university. If you will not be able in the end to provide them with jobs, there are some academics who would tell you that having an educated unemployed youth is even more dangerous than having an uneducated employed youth. So it is a very, very big problem that is facing the country. And then for me, when we look at the whole issue of inequality, we also very often point out to the fact that now in South Africa we have freedom, we have democracy, we have universal suffrage, so we have equality. And my counter-argument is always that we should not for a minute underestimate the huge inequality of the so-called equal playing field. As a university educator, I see it on a daily basis in my own university. We open up our universities and bring these, and they're black. The poor in the country are black people. We have to be very, very open about this. It's still black people who are poor. So we open up our universities, we bring these young black students in, and then we sit back and we cannot understand why it is that so many of them fail. There is a huge failure rate amongst this group of young people, and it's a race-based failure rate. Why is that? It's an equal playing field. They're at the same university, they're on the same campus, they get exactly the same education as the white students on campus. What is happening here? And my argument is that they are competing on an unequal playing field because they come from hugely deprived backgrounds, bad education that they get at school level, whereas white kids can still, their parents can still buy their way out of a problematic school education. But black kids' parents cannot buy them out of that problem area. So we sit with students who arrive at university. They're clever. They made it in terms of the requirements. But apart from the fact that they come from a deprived educational background, they are dirt poor when they get to campus. They cannot pay for their accommodation. They cannot pay for their money. I've got a sister who runs our student services on our campus, and she tells horrific stories of these young people coming to Pretoria and sleeping on the streets. And then we complain about the fact that these kids do not do well, and we say, but you know, it's equal now, everyone can come in. And that is why, again, why I say that the next decade is going to be much more difficult than the first decade was, because we settled for a kind of democracy that is not a social democracy, that is not it is a democracy that brought political freedom to many, but it did not really bring economic freedom. It did not really bring an opportunity for people to participate fully in what is going on. And this I ascribe to a failure in leadership in the country. And I see, Leonard, you're looking at your watch. How long do I have? Because then I can start to speed up.
10 hours more.
Okay, give me 10 minutes, and then I will quickly see what I can do when I talk about the failure of leadership. I think there are several very visible trends of this failure of leadership. First of all, the entrenchment of white privilege. And I think this is manifested in income trends. And I can talk about this, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm white myself. I'm Afrikaans speaking. I mean, I come from that group of people against whom many of you fought very valiantly. We were privileged. Under apartheid, we are still privileged. If you want a nice little statistic to prove this to you, in 1996, the ratio of white per capita income to that of all other races in the country was 3.9 to 1. By 2 years ago, 2012, the latest statistics that I could come across, it was 4.5 to 1. So in other words, we have grown richer since the end of apartheid, not poorer. And that is it's not some big conspiracy or anything. It has to do, again, with choice of economic policy. Those who have had their access to wealth and to wealth creation actually entrenched. It was easy. That's why I'm talking about the inequality of the so-called equal playing field. So what we see, and in that sense, a failure of leadership. How is it possible that we end up 20 years later, we have grown the economy, the average growth rate until about 2 years ago has been much higher over the past 20 years than it was during the last decade of apartheid. What happened to all of that money? Well, we know now that some of that money stayed in the hands of white people. It created the economic growth, the wealth that was created in the country, created only a very small black elite. If we want to measure the size of that black elite in terms of management positions in the economy, for instance, if we look at top management positions, the black African share is about 12%. Senior management position, their share is 18%. Yet remember that whites, for instance, now constitute less than 10% of the total population, because already by 2004, more than 1 million white people had emigrated from South Africa. So in real terms and in relative terms, the white population is shrinking. But when we talk about this group, this black economic elite, and we measure them in terms of who are the managers in our economy, we see that they are still very, very small. We also know that capital in relation to organized labor has been hugely strengthened. And that's the story across the world. I'm not saying that I'm not pleading exceptionalism in the case of South Africa. I'm just trying to show how it played out in one specific country, all these trends internationally. You know, when the mine workers' strike in the Platinum Belt was on, many of you will know about it. It was a very long strike early this year. It ran for more than 5 years. The mine workers demanded a minimum wage of 12,500 rand per month. And again, a lot of people, economic analysts said, this is unrealistic. We can't pay people 12,500 rand a month. But you know, then you look at what the mine bosses take home. And remember what I said, we can have a kind of a logic and explain it and say, but you know, it's a high-risk thing, and they risk all their money and their intelligence and whatever else we want to say. But if you're poor, those kinds of arguments don't go down. So you're fighting for 12,500 rand a month. Your boss takes home, listen to what they take home, Anglo Gold's Mark Kutifani earned 43 million rand in 2012. I mean, these guys are battling for 12,500 rand a month. You understand? And I can go on. I've got lots of figures around the income of these mining bosses. Analysts will tell you, but if you look at the share of what they take home, their wealth, it's only about 0.5% of the wage bill for the mining sector in a year. Yeah, because there are so few of them. Again, there's a kind of a logic to that. But that logic does not trickle down to ordinary people. You take the wealth out of the ground, you get 12,500 rand a month, or rather, you have to battle to get there. They're not there yet. Your boss takes home 43 million. So that is a problem. And where does this come from? I think, first of all, the way in which we try to bring more black people into the economy. The Black Economic Empowerment Policy created a very sharp hierarchy to few people there. It didn't broaden the base, so the hierarchy grows higher and narrower. But your base is very, very broad. In other words, where the poor people are. The second thing is corruption has turned into a huge problem. I don't want to go on too much about that because I agree with my colleague Jackie Silje at the Institute for Strategic Studies that we are overemphasizing that our perceptions of corruption in South Africa are actually bigger than the corruption is. And I think he's right. And I think that there are still many people, especially in government, who are not corrupt. And we tend to think of the whole system as being corrupt. And that's not the problem. Your problem is the fact that when there is corruption, it is very visible and it involves huge amounts of money. And it also involves huge damage to ordinary people. When the nephew of President Zuma and his friends bought out that mine there at Grootvlei in Mpumalanga a few years ago, they made literally millions of rands of profit there, yet a few thousand black and white mine workers lost their jobs and became completely destitute. Now that kind of thing is what creates this image of huge corruption amongst the top people in government, because you see these ordinary people who suffer from it. Another huge problem in terms of our leadership is the idea of cadre deployment. In other words, you do not look in your civil service at what is the expertise that is required, almost in a Soviet Union kind of way. You deploy your senior managers in terms of their political affiliation and not in terms of what it is that they can actually deliver when it comes to efficiency. And lastly, what we sit with is that huge problem at the moment in the governing party, and that is the faction fighting within the party, for the simple reason that black economic empowerment policies go through the state. The state becomes your preferred model of accumulation. So there are huge fights to get into government because that is how you get access to some of this money. So the fights are not necessarily around the ideological underpinnings of the policies that we formulate and implement. The fight is about who will get, as that book so famously titled around Kenya, our turn to eat. There's this argument about it's now our turn to eat. A different faction will try to get in and to draw the benefit from this. So all in all, perhaps, as I've said, a rather grim picture of what is going on. I don't think it's a case of all is lost, not at all. But what I do think what we will have to look at in our countries, we do need inspired leadership. I think there's a very, very big shortage of that. If our inspired leadership is someone like Julius Malema, the young Mr. Malema, with the greatest of respect, I'm not sure that it is really going to help us to get out of our third decade of democracy and freedom in an unscathed way. It is perhaps a bigger problem for us than the three of poverty, unemployment and inequality that persist, and that is the fact that we do not really see inspired leadership, at least not in the way that we saw it in the late anti-apartheid years and in the early years of the post-apartheid era. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you very much. Now I'll turn to Bengt Säve Söderbergh first to give comments as a discussant, but also some other points you said you were going to raise.
Thank you very much. Those of you sitting here, some of you have some life experience, which means you were probably part of the struggle against apartheid in various ways. So my comments will be two. First, let me say something about the role Sweden played up until liberation. Then my second comment will be about what you were talking about. Why is it like this? I'm not challenging what you said, but I would like to make some more complications. I mean, you have to ask yourself after listening to you, are they evil people who took over? Just greedy people? Or did they have any spirit of, let's say, of ANC, of a country for all? Well, let me come back to that. But let me first say, I was part of the struggle against apartheid for many decades. I was in the foreign ministry, I was here and there. And now I have written the first book in Swedish about the role of Sweden, but also about the situation, not just in South Africa, but in all the Portuguese-speaking countries and Zimbabwe and Namibia. And this will be available after the show here. But let me say, what was the role of Sweden? Because nobody has really tried to draw conclusions. Did we play an important role, or did we even play a role that changed things? And my thinking after having interviewed many people and looked at things is our role was much more important than people thought. Let me give you very briefly, and you will complain because I simplify, but you have to do that when you have little time. All this is in the book. When we first had the decision by Parliament in Sweden in 1969 to support the liberation movements in Africa, in Southern Africa, ANC was in complete shambles. ANC had been more or less destroyed. As we all know, many of their leaders were on Robben Island. Oliver Tambo was the only one in the leadership who had escaped and visited Sweden and so on. The message from ANC to us in those days were two. One, we are going to win this struggle through the armed struggle, because at that time they were very much influenced by what was taking place in the Portuguese colonies, in Angola, in Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. And there, where the liberation movements were struggling against a crumbling fascism, they were successful. The second message was, leave South Africa. Stop, close your embassy and get all your companies out of South Africa. The answer from our side was we didn't do any of that. We didn't support the armed struggle. And we didn't listen to the, from the beginning, so to say. We didn't listen to the idea of isolating South Africa. Instead, the decision was, what can we do to build the organizations which one day hopefully will come to power? Could ANC become a government in waiting? And there started work which lasted for 20 years. Not just ANC, but trade unions, churches, and only just with ANC, the amount spent from Swedish taxpayers and from money raised through other ways was 2 billion crowns over all these years. And Sweden was almost unique, because this was the Cold War. The Americans, the British, all these people, they were on the side of apartheid for a number of other reasons, because they saw the world, there is Moscow, there is Washington, you choose. We didn't buy that message because we believed that ANC didn't want to choose this or that. They wanted to choose South Africa, and the same with the other liberation movements. Now, when then the 80s came, I mean, I see one person in the back there, Birgitta, who was part of this, and I just mention as one example that the treasurer of ANC, Mr. Thomas Nkobi, he had to learn what is internal audit. Now that is not very sexy for a liberation movement, but if you want to build an organization which is functioning, that's what we could contribute, basically these kinds of things. Now comes the 80s, and the situation for the South African apartheid government becomes untenable. There is uproar all over the country, and there is more and more build-up, and they finally find out that here is an ANC, there are other organizations, trade unions and so on, and they actually have some very good leadership. And partly this was very much because we were the only country that had helped them build all this. I think they had 30 representation in 30 different countries, almost most of it paid by Sweden. And we were proud to be this single country which stood out from the calls of the Cold War. It's a little bit like Palestine at this time, I would say. But then came the situation so the apartheid government, I've talked to many of them, they said, okay, so maybe one thing is to start talking to Mandela, whom the world and the South Africans had not forgotten. They thought that by putting him on Robben Island, they will forget him. But it happened in totally the other way. And ANC, and they made contact. And they said, finally they came to the conclusion that we have to talk, we have to negotiate. And people say there, in their judgment, and also on the side of ANC, if there hadn't been this fairly efficient organization which was doing work in many different fields, there would not have been this option for negotiations. So people from different sides say, if you hadn't been there, you Swedes, with all the things you did, even Isaac and all these pushing things, but basically mostly building organizations inside the country We did a lot of work also in secrecy inside the country, particularly in the 80s, and so on. That made it the case for negotiations, and that, as several people said, that saved us from the bloodbath that so many people had warned about, and it saved hundreds and thousands of people. So I made this very simple, but of course it's more complicated. Everything is more complicated. But that's my one comment. The other one, now, when you listen to the speech here, you can wonder, why is it like this? Is it because ANC was transformed into a country or a party of just greedy people, or is it more complicated? The explanation I find, which people don't think about so much, and which I've heard from several sides, is that when Mandela became president in '94, from our side, okay, from outside, we said, okay, fine, now you divide the country and you give everybody resources. So everybody was happy, except the stock exchange, because there was a fear that these people who don't give so much of a damn about democracy, they would take their money out, because at that time, you know, we have a liberal global economy, and they would take it out. There was also a great fear that even more people, white people, would leave the country and take their things along. And thirdly, during the run-up to these elections in '94, there had been attacks from intelligence people, from apartheid lovers who would say, we will not accept anything but apartheid, and they were willing to take up arms, as you know. And there was Inkatha, which accepted elections just 3-4 days before they took place. So, and they found that the coffers were empty. The government before had spent, and there was a large deficit in the state economy. So the big issue was the worry. Will a combination of these things lead to chaos, and will we and possibly civil war, and will we therefore suffer the same fate as Yugoslavia did at that time, or some other African countries which were torn apart by armed conflict? So today you can say, so this led to, as you were saying, the desertion of the election manifesto that ANC had gone to elections with, because they felt, if we try this, and I've heard it from several people, we may face a situation of new armed conflict. Was this a correct conclusion, or was it wrong? Nobody can tell. But what we can say today is that South Africa is still one country. That was not taken for granted. And it is a democracy. But the price they paid was all these forgiveness, and that Mandela became world famous for. But the economy stayed in white hands. And of course, the message to the average person then became, gee, is my family going to make it? Well, some, as you described, could so to say do it, but very few could do it the regular way. So people said, well, I want to be part of this, and that opened the gates, of course, for all kinds of behavior. Despite that, they have achieved, and I would say the ANC is very divided. It is partly is greedy people like Zuma, and partly it's people who still believe in the idea of, you know, a just and fair society. Well,
Thank you.
I will stop there.
Okay, Magnus.
Thanks. My name is Magnus Walan. I come from Diakonia. I work there. But my background is within the NGO sector. I was very active in the Swedish anti-apartheid movement from the late 70s up till 94. I spent a lot of time in South Africa during those years, but I don't follow South Africa that closely nowadays. I thought it was very interesting to hear you both now, and I have some question marks and some comments on that. Maybe I should start with the history. I think that it is important to recognize the importance of the broad anti-apartheid movement in supporting the changes that we saw in South Africa. And I think it is also recognized by the liberation movement in this. I saw an interview with the former head of the South African Security Service, Neil Barnard, where he said that in mid-80s we were so isolated that we had to do something. And that was in relation to the growing sanctions that we saw, the IMF who refused to give new loans, the increased cost for importing oil, importing arms. Yes, they got hold of it, but they had to pay so much more. So that was a kind of a taxation that we created through the sanction works. And I think that this is also important to pinpoint, also in Sweden. I mean, I remember Billy Modise, who was the ANC head in Stockholm for many years. He said that we had a deliberate strategy to mobilize the Swedish people to challenge the political leaders on left and on the right to support the ANC and the democratic movement and to introduce sanctions. So it was not just that it happened. It was a deliberate, long process to challenge, also in Sweden, the political leadership and the governments. And more so in the UK and the United States, where Thatcher and Reagan very strongly opposed, but they were forced by the people in the congresses to impose various kind of small steps for sanctions. And I do agree that Sweden have a proud history in supporting the change democratic movement and the anti-apartheid struggle. But I think it's important to emphasize that it didn't just come. You know, it was a very tough campaigning that was going on. I have some also question marks when it comes to your picture. I agree with most what you were saying from my perspective sitting here in Sweden. But I have some question marks when you were talking about the economical model. Yes, I think that is correct. I remember I heard a story from somebody, ANC member of the Parliament Finance Committee, who said that we had our election platform, we had the reconstruction and development program, and one day our Minister of Finance came into the room and said that this is the new policies. GEAR. It was a new economical policies, more economical liberal. And it was said World Bank on the first page. So it was not just something that came up within the discussions within the ANC leadership. It was something quite new, according to the tradition of the ANC, of discussion, building platforms, mobilizing people, and then come to united positions. And this was also something which came from the outside partly. But of course, the governments had their choices in how they then choose this. But corruption could be described in many different forms. I remember this quote from Schoeman not that long ago when he said to a number of businessmen in Johannesburg, so join the ANC, then you will make money. He said something like that. And that also affects the quality of the leaders. It is a relation in between them. So you can measure, either you said that, well, can you prove grand corruption or not? Or is it also the kind of leaders that you recruit? I think it is important to emphasize, and I've been studying this very carefully, is Sweden has a proud history in supporting the anti-party struggle, but we do not have a proud history in supporting the new South Africa. I mean, Sweden, we have a huge guilt for the corruption in South Africa when it comes to the Swedish arms export to South Africa. I've read the police investigations from the US, I've read them from the UK, and I've read it from the South African police who've been trying to investigate this, or parts of it, because it's a number of boxes. But I've read affidavits, summaries of these investigations. I've seen the bank records. So to me, it's not a question mark. Somebody could, if they want to sue in court, I'm welcome, I would say, because I would present this paper. The only problem is that the confidentiality of the source from these people who have given these information to me. But for me, I'm really 100% convinced that Sweden had a huge responsibility in poisoning the new democratic government in '99. We're talking about numbers, according to these bank records, of 1.5 billion rands, who went to key people within the ANC leaders, to cabinet members, to individuals in the ANC leaderships, and to their allies organizations. So it's huge money, and I think that the signals that's created was the worst. It went to the party, but it also, everybody knew this, and everybody knows this within the ANC leadership. I have a friend who was a prominent minister, cabinet minister in one of the provinces. He was a member of the NEC, national executive of the ANC. He told me that, well, I don't have any details of this. This was just a little group who knew about this, who was handling this. But we all know it happened. And if they did that, why couldn't I? I've also suffered. I've been in jail, and I have bared my consequences for not being able to do my studies when I took my time for the struggle. So now it's my time, he said. He admitted that. And I think that I can't, I haven't got figures in the way that he was corrupt or I can pinpoint, but I think that the political effects of this was so extremely bad for South Africa. So I have some question marks when it comes to, I can't pinpoint statistics, but I can pinpoint the political effects of this and what that means to affect the political leadership. I saw some statistics that we today have 3 violent social protests a day. 3 violent social protests a day. It's enormous. To me, that is very contradicting with just looking at the facts of the elections, that ANC is given so much support. But on the other hand, we can see the daily lives of the people living in the shanty towns, in the squatters, who the only reason for them is not living in extreme poverty is their social grants. If it wasn't for the social grants, they would be living in complete poverty. And also the huge gap between the policies, the constitution, the legislations even, and the reality on the ground. Maybe it's not corruption, but I think it is, yes, of course, economical policies. I heard a year ago an old friend of mine from the union movement in South Africa, Jay Naidoo, who was also minister in the first cabinet under Mandela, he was speaking in Sweden. And he said that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that he said that the amount of money for education for black has increased 10 times. So it's an enormous investment. But due to the lack of governance, in a way, you cannot see that when it comes to output for for the quality of the education, on the exam, and so on, because money is not spelt well, and the question of lack of efficient governance. And I thought that was extremely important in analyzing the situation. Maybe I should end there, but it's just a few comments.
Okay, I think that we have got a very good presentation on the present situation. We have also got now some points on the historical context, and I think Magnus touched, but perhaps not enough. And perhaps you should, when you comment what they say, you should take up this the issue of, I mean, how much of the problems in South Africa are, and you alluded to it, but how much is really internal problems in South Africa, and how much is, if you, I mean, part of what you described, you could probably use similar description from other countries in the world, even Sweden, when it comes to, but not the same amounts and so on, but I mean, youth and unemployment and so on. I mean, so I mean, one question is really how much of these developments, what is really the room of maneuver for the leadership of South Africa. And the second point, I think, which is also very important, but this is of course very difficult to discuss, and that is, I mean, development takes time. I mean, when you mentioned 10 times as much as now going into education, we know that it takes a very long time and a lot of efforts to make money into some real educational sort of institutions that work. And I mean, education is difficult. I mean, it's not just to throw money on education, it's really much more when it comes to quality in education. So I mean, that is another question, of course, is are we impatient? Can you, should we leave to Maxi now to comment on your, and then we open up for comment from the floor? Or?
No, that's all right.
Okay. Some very interesting comments, Magnus. I find your comment on the arms deal incredibly interesting. I haven't thought of it in the sense of, you're right, it came in the late 1990s. If I look back, that was perhaps one of the first big indications that something was wrong around this whole issue of corruption. I was talking to a colleague of mine last night who said to me, watch the current maneuverings around the so-called, these secret nuclear deals. I don't know whether people are aware of it, but the Zuma government is concluding, Russia. That's right, with Russia. And he said it's going to be your arms deal number 2. And so between last night and this evening, I'm getting an education. But I think you are right. As to the education thing, I think the problem in South Africa is that one can say we should be patient. I remember the late 1990s and early 2000s when President Mbeki on the regular evening news would talk about South Africa's economy and the economic policy, and he would keep on saying, but in the long run, everyone will benefit. And I remember how I used to think to myself, but how do we explain to people about now? That thing, it's like Alice in Wonderland. When are we going to have dessert tomorrow? Tomorrow. It never arrives in a certain way. 20 years is a long time. If you look at the amount of money that has been pumped into education and how little has come out of it, I'm not sure that it has something to do so much with it's a short time period. I think it has to do much more with mismanagement. Every couple of years we have a new education policy. People no longer, they don't know.
Sweden?
Yeah, exactly. We have the same Sweden.
But you see, in that sense, as I said earlier on, we're not exceptional. This is increasingly the story of an ordinary country, but it's an ordinary country that is trying to achieve some extraordinary things because of an extraordinary history. And to use this excuse that it's something is the same the world over is also not an excuse. That's why we are in the mess that we're in across the world. Because we all use that excuse of, You talk about South Africa, it's exactly the same. The people told me that in Finland as well. I said, "Oh, you complain about your education." I said, you have no idea what's going on here. And then one cannot help but think, but you know, we're all guilty then. Because we all use that as an excuse. It has to stop somewhere. One would have thought that South Africa would have been idealistic enough to stop this. And I do think it is possible still to stop it. And I think there's immense goodwill in the country for change and for giving up things. But people are getting more scared because of this perception that the state cannot deal efficiently and in a morally correct way with the money that comes to them. And that's always a pity if you start losing that goodwill. In the early years there was so much goodwill, then you mess it up a little bit, and then people no longer want to be all that giving. And you talk about so many people supporting the ANC. It's true. You know, in 1994 the ANC gained 63% of the vote. In 2014, it gained 62% of the vote. It's interesting. There's hardly been any change. Your problem, however, is the fact that 40% of the voters didn't vote.
Yeah.
So you understand?
Yeah.
It's
here.
And that explains to a very large extent your, and just by the way, it is, I have figures for 5 to 6 of these violent protests a day. Something that we've had to get used to. In the old days, you would just listen to the news in the morning. Now you turn on the news. I even do it here in Sweden. It's wonderful what the internet can do. And I listen because then I feel I'm home. And then every morning now, part of the traffic news, never used to be like this, is telling you which roads are closed because of these violent protests. It's a new thing in the country. It was never there. You know, it gives you a sense of how things are.
Before.
Yeah, but that was in the 80s. But I'm talking about post-1990. This never happened. So a huge group of people who no longer have faith in the government, they don't want to vote. A huge group of people who feel that violent protest is the only way in which the government is going to listen. And I just think that it's a difficult situation lying ahead.
Thank you very much. Now we have some time for questions, so the floor is open. Yes?
My name is Ulla Andren, and I have spent the past 3 years in Mozambique. And I wanted to get a perspective from the regional impact of developments in South Africa. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you were painting a very gloomy picture in terms of economic development, high unemployment, etc. But still, in the Southern Africa perspective, South Africa is the economic powerhouse of the region. When you were talking about unemployment, you didn't mention all the illegal immigrants from Zimbabwe and Mozambique and other places as well. Could you say something on how you see these developments for the future? Because the economic
Can you take 2 or 3 questions?
Governance aspects of South Africa have a huge impact on the whole region. Thank you.
Okay, we take 3 questions at a time. So, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
My name is Jonathan Freud. I lived in South Africa for the last 10 years. First, thank you very much for a very interesting and correct presentation. Magnus, I would say to you that, I plan to say more or less what you said, especially about the Swedish involvement in this arms deal and so on. Thirdly, I met a few times Mnguzuthu Buthelezi, and he said to me that the main reason why the apartheid system fell apart was not the support from the outside world. It was definitely not the armed struggle of the ANC, which was a failure. The main reason was the complete craziness of the whole system as such. It couldn't work in the long run. And I would like to comment on that. But I heard another friend in South Africa that said something that you could comment on a little bit. He said that this whole system that we have now, with all the corruption, with all the mismanagement that you have talked about, in the long run, it will open people's eyes and minds and hearts. How long will people vote for ANC with their hearts? And when will the day come when they start voting with their minds?
Okay, that wasn't question, perhaps, but it's worth commenting. One more. Okay, we can start with these two questions.
You may perhaps know that the figures around the illegal immigrants are hugely contested in South Africa. Some people would say 1 million, some say 6 million, 7 million. I don't think anyone really has an idea. I'm also not always convinced that that is a contribution to the unemployment, to the high unemployment figures, especially when we talk about the formal definition of unemployment, because they would not be able to get into that part of the sector in any case. I would think that the high unemployment problem would be as big as it is now, even had there been no illegal immigrants, because we're not documenting them properly. I do not think that there is enough evidence to show that they are actually contributing to the unemployment. I think rather that what is happening is that we are creating increasingly difficult relations with our neighbors because of, you may have seen the latest set of regulations, visa regulations, etc., which won't help, because we're talking the illegal immigrants. It's like, you target people who would in any case have done the right thing. You're just making it more and more difficult for them to come into the country. So I do not, let me rather say, I do not think it's not a problem in terms of putting a drain on our resources. I just think that with or without illegal immigrants, we would have still had all three of these problems: the inequality, the poverty, and our good ideas of exporting economic development to the region. That's a whole separate topic. What is South Africa doing, and how well is it working? How honest are we also in our dealings with the rest of the region?
What is your opinion on that, perhaps? Mm-hmm. What is your opinion on that?
Mixed. It's a mixed record. I think that some businesses are doing very well, but I also think that South Africa is sometimes very, very stupid and naive. When you look at what we did in the DRC, we pumped millions, if not billions of rands into development assistance, if you want, post-conflict reconstruction and development. We got nothing out of it. And to the extent that we built capacity, the capacity to organize, to regulate, etc., to generate contracts, and so on, all of those went to others, especially to the Chinese. So South Africa needs to look at this in a serious way. I just think we do not really have our business act together in the sub-region, and it is very difficult, as you would know, to control some of these businesses. And we know that especially in Kenya, for instance, some South African business investments there actually undermined small Kenyan-grown business ventures there, completely undermined it, and it does not give us a good name on the continent, and it does not inspire confidence in South Africa's so-called leadership. Whether we were, I completely agree with this idea of it was such a crazy system. I do think it helped outside efforts, but yes, it couldn't stay on. Once the tide turned within the Afrikaner community, and I say that because I come from a very conservative background, and I saw how crazy the system was in the early 1970s when A few of us, being white and Afrikaans, went as far as to join a liberal English student organization that was anti-apartheid, and we all got expelled from university and we weren't allowed back until the late 1980s. So, you know, we went back with a 20 to 25 year, what does one say, achterstand, backlog, compared to our other friends who played the game. It was crazy what happened, that, you know, that whole system. But how long will people vote with their heart and not with their minds? We can ask the same question of the white community in South Africa to a very large extent. If you look at their attitudes, etc., it's still hugely driven by emotion and not necessarily by kind of a logic. And to the extent that we can explain a logic, then we have to ask ourselves, is that what we see when people no longer vote for ANC and they don't stay at home, but they vote for Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters? Is that an indication of a new kind of logic that is, and is that the kind of logic that we would like to see? So maybe we're in for another crazy ride. I hope it's not as crazy as we saw in the 70s and 80s, but still.
Okay, I know that both Magnus and Bengt want to come in, but first perhaps if there are any other questions. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Leon. I grew up in South Africa for 30 years. I'm the same similar circumstances probably you did, very conservative. Moved to Sweden for the last 14 years.
Do people hear you?
Moved to Sweden for the last 14 years. Well, I sort of thank you for explaining it, the situation, you know, in the tense contradictions that South Africa has and all the complexities. My question to you is like, what's the temperature on ground level for the average people? I mean, when the whole change took place, it was about building a new fair and you know, South Africa, and people were proud of building this. Are they losing hope? Are they still on ground level people, you know, who believe in the new South Africa, in a South Africa? Or are you starting to see some of the thing that it's a brain drain? You know, people are giving up.
Let us see. Any more questions? Okay, one more.
My name is Tanya, student at Stockholm University, and I was wondering, you talked a lot about grant corruption. Do you have any comments on petty corruption? How that works? In the like service delivery?
Okay, let us take in them first. Okay, Bengt, if you start.
No, I just wanted to add a few things. Just three simple comments about South Africa. I mean, the problem of a country today, South Africa shares some economic problems with Sweden. We're both extremely dependent on the outside world and for international trade. But the South African economy is actually three types. There is the informal economy, there is the the farming economy, which is going down. There is the industrial economy, which is going down. And what moves, and now is the biggest, is the service sector. And those jobs, I mean, it's like listening to the election campaign in Sweden, demands much higher qualifications. So South Africa is faced with those. It's not these old traditional jobs where you didn't need a lot of training. That's one thing. The other thing I want to point out is that if you look at Southern Africa, by natural resources, it is the richest part of the world. Ulla, who just came from Mozambique, when we were cooperating and supporting Mozambique in the 80s, it was seen just as a very, very poor country with nothing except people. Now it seems to develop into the richest country, well, anyway, a very, very rich country, and it's shared with the neighbors. The question, big question now, is how to organize so that the benefits go to the majority of the people. And that's not such an easy thing. That brings me to my third comment. People don't necessarily vote with their hearts in South Africa. They vote on ANC because there is no alternative. I mean, this Malema is just a symptom of populism. Of course, he could be dangerous. The other party is seen as a white party, the DA. And so there isn't much of an alternative. And that is shared by most countries in Africa, if you look upon it, where the democracy is moving forward. And they don't accept the way they used to, military coups and things. Look at just what happens in Ouagadougou these days. But, so I would say, of course, these countries like South Africa could have a bright future. And I am not the least hesitant about this. I think there is so much to do, such fantastic possibilities, and I just wouldn't like to end this just with facing on what goes wrong. Of course, loads of things go wrong, and I was shocked by the arms deal as well. I was not in government in those days.
Magnus?
To start up in the end a bit, I saw some statistics that just came the other day from South Africa saying that the two richest persons in South Africa owns just as much as 50% of the rest of the population. That's and that is just, you were talking about salaries and income, but that is just top of the iceberg because that is what they report. In the discussions after what had happened now in the Marikana massacre, there has been discussion of the mining company Lonmin and the ownership and the income. They said that we couldn't repair the houses, we couldn't make the investments for the workers. The houses was falling apart. But when somebody went in to dig in the economy of that company, they found out they had transferred their money and their wealth to tax havens, enormous amounts. And this has come back. That is what I'm working with in Sweden right now, to work with the question of tax haven and capital flight, because that is stealing money that could have been used in social investments and to fight against poverty, and not just to talking about their reported income. And that goes as a huge global problems, the inequality and the how money is transferred in secrecy to tax havens, etc. Just another comment when you were talking about Buthelezi. He and the Inkatha movement is a complex movement, for sure. But the knowledge I have of Buthelezi was in the 80s and the early 90s, where Inkatha was part and working with the South African military and police in massacres, in violent activities where they the purpose was to weaken the ANC and democratic movement within the democratic process that was coming, where thousands of people were killed, and where there's evidence that these Inkatha movements were trained, the so-called impis, by the South African army and police in Caprivi, in KwaZulu-Natal. And I follow that very closely on the spot. Several of my close friends were killed by Inkatha people, so that affects me strongly, because that goes for the clerk as well. And I agree with Mandela's sentiments on the clerk of his when he realized the double standards of the clerk and Buthelezi when it comes to participating in the violence. With one hand, on the other hand, they were talking about democracy negotiations. And for me, that is not a question mark. And I think it is very important to listen to. I saw a speech that was held by Gerrit Viljoen, who was one of the people within the Nationalist Party who negotiated during the processes between 85 and onwards up to 1990, when the unbanning came and so on. He held a speech for the Nationalist Party in 1990 in Bloemfontein, where he explained to the Nationalist Party that we have to do this because we were so weakened, our economy was so bankrupt, and so we had to, make compromises with the ANC. We don't want a majority rule. We want to have separate powers for the whites. And that was their platform, but they were forced and also, how should I say, convinced for another route, of course. But it was. I think it's very interesting. It's important for history that we don't rewrite it. It was a battle that was fought by the people inside South Africa, mainly through non-violent means. I agree with you on the armed struggle, but that it was a deliberate struggle, that it was a very clever struggle, I would say. I will never forget, went to one of the funerals in Alexandra in '86, where the police said to me, if you go in there, they will kill you. They hate whites. And coming in there and meeting the grieving mothers, and I came as a representative of the anti-apartheid movement, and I was, honorary guest. And that, I didn't meet any kind of racism. And that was thanks to the ANC and its message of non-racialism, which was so strong in that way.
Okay, Maxi, you get the last word.
And it has to be a quick one.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. One doesn't want to end all of this on a terribly bleak note. That's why I started off by saying that I'm very much aware that there's a luxury in being so critical, and that luxury shows an achievement of the country, that we can be sort of very open and honest about what is going on. I think most of those whites who had wanted to leave the country because they cannot live with a post-apartheid environment, I think most of them are gone now, and it's a great, I think, asset for the country. I think there is much hope, but then we need to keep on being critical, and we need to question our leaders, and we need to point out that we need leadership. We can't just accept it and smile the whole time. One has to fight for these things to prevent that things get worse. And I'm convinced that after the current Zuma term, things will get better. It's just that there's not a clear sense of the leadership that will emerge, and I think it's part of the politics, very much like Mr. Mugabe used to run it, although we will not, I don't think we'll get into that kind of difficulty. And let me just also say, right at the end, when I criticize, it's an ANC government, when I criticize them, I do not think that we should think of the corrupt as the ANC being corrupt. I think it's very clear, and we meet these people every day. There are people who are hugely committed within the ANC, who are very efficient, who are absolutely against corruption. So it's not a case of a whole party that is corrupt. It is a product that we're seeing now of things that have happened under a particular form of leadership. And I am convinced that it will change again, and that change will come from the youth also, to a large extent. When I look at our students, their commitment, what they want to do, where they want to go, I think to myself, it will be okay, but I need to be critical, and I need to point out to them what is going wrong in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that 2 points came to me in this discussion. The first is you cannot talk about present South Africa without coming also into the historical context. That's quite interesting. And the second point I think you made very clear, and I think your most important point was really that there are a lot of challenges and they could have been tackled differently. So it's really a question of leadership. That is really what you say.
Absolutely.
I mean, even if the world is there and certain things are pressed on you, there is options,
There's
that
always
is
a choice.
there is always a choice, and that depends on
Also
the,
for us.
also for us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me give you from FUF, all of you, a small gift,
Oh,
Thank you.
and a special gift for you to
And
read.
can I add just, this book is in Swedish. I brought a few copies, and I'm perfectly willing to
Sell it.
sell them at a very
High
good
price.
price.